Okay, thank you. I know it's been a long couple of days. Everybody's probably exhausted, so please bear with me if you can for the last presentation. So I want to say thanks, obviously, to Nina and Jeffrey for putting on the conference and inviting me to speak. It's always great to come back to Kosovo. I've been coming here for many, many years, and it's a particularly interesting time to be here at the moment. What I wanted to talk about, I guess, is something related to, more broadly, kind of an understanding of great powers in international relations and how, I don't want to get too technical about it, but in international relations theory, we talk about how the powers at any given time determine the rules of the game, essentially. And they decide what the prevailing norms are, what the laws are, what the nature of state practice is. And ultimately, the prevailing distribution of power at the international level determines the power dynamics within specific interstate relationships, which is what I want to focus on with respect to Kosovo. Now, the issue that I want to talk about, having talked about that first, is then to talk about how that impacts on Kosovo, because Kosovo is a very, very interesting. I'm always trying to tell my students this back in the UK, you know, you've got to study Kosovo. One of the reasons why is because it straddles this particular period where we had a shift from a unipolar world order to certainly the decline of the West and what we would describe as an emerging multipolar world order. And it's within that context that we can start to see why the things that have happened in Kosovo, or happened to Kosovo in the last sort of, let's say at least 6 or 7 years, have happened. Because Kosovo is effectively affected, if you will, by the structural change. And Kosovo's importance to the West has always only been symbolic and shallow, effectively. And as the power dynamics internationally have shifted, that has become more and more evident, leading to the situation that we have here today. And Kosovo is increasingly, I think, dispensable to the West. Before and finally, I just want to talk about how Kosovo can redress this degradation in going forward. But before I do, I just want to talk about a couple of things that were mentioned yesterday and again today. Just briefly, I guess one of the things that I would take issue with is the idea that we've entered into a kind of a new dark age in international law, that things were good and now they're not, and we're all very sad about that. There's an element of truth to that, obviously, but I think it does exaggerate this kind of golden age of international law that ostensibly existed between, let's say, 1991 and 2008. It was during this period that we had the invasion of Iraq, that we had the United States' very hostile approach to the International Criminal Court, and it must be said, Western states still supported tyrannical regimes all around the world. The approach that the West took to international law during that period was extremely inconsistent, extremely selective. And when the Cold War ended, there was a real opportunity to change international law, to make it less obviously political, to alter the dynamics within the system. But the West effectively decided not to do that, decided to keep the system the way it was, which enabled it to maintain its very selective and inconsistent approach to international law. Now, what we're seeing today is that other states have become more powerful, and they're effectively copying the West. They're saying, well, if you guys have a selective and inconsistent approach to international law, well, why can't we? So it's not that some, wonderful golden era has diminished and the good guys are gone. It's that the good guys behaved very badly, I think, during that particular period and didn't lay sufficiently strong foundations for a new international legal order. Nina mentioned yesterday about the hidden politics behind international law. And again, I think it's important just to come back to something that was mentioned yesterday too. The idea that all states are equal, because it says so under Article 2.1 of the UN Charter, is a fiction. It was mentioned yesterday, the Treaty of Westphalia in 1648. If you go back even further to the Peace of Augsburg in 1555, ostensibly all states are equal. But if you look at between 1648 and 1815, the number of states in the world actually declined. Why? Because big states swallowed up small states. So we've never had a situation where somebody writes down a law that says all states are equal, sovereignty is inviolable, and states go, oh, okay, we'll have to abide by that. That just simply hasn't happened. It's not just that inequality is built into the practice of states, it's actually built into the constitution of the international system. The UN Charter 2.1 says all states are equal, but we also have the Security Council. Now, you clearly have 5 states, the permanent 5 members of the Security Council, that are not just in practice more powerful than our states, are actually constitutionally privileged with these competencies related to the veto and the enforcement of international law that gives them massively more power internationally than anybody else. So again, we look at the General Assembly and go, well, look at that, that's great, everybody is equal in there. They're not. The whole edifice of international law is predicated on this constitutional conflation of power and law enforcement. And that didn't change in 1991. It didn't change in 1999, and it hasn't changed since. So again, when we see things like the behavior of the Security Council with respects to Syria or Myanmar or something like that today, I don't think we can say, oh my God, this is awful. This is something new and dark. It's always been that way. We've had instances since between, let's say, 91 and 2008, where the Security Council could have done something to enforce international law, but chose not to. Chose not to, whether that was Rwanda in 1994 or elsewhere. Okay, so that inconsistency and the conflation of politics and law enforcement is not just a kind of a secondary aspect that occasionally comes into the international system, it's actually built into the system. And in that respect, I don't think we can be surprised when we look at the practice of either the Security Council or international legal bodies set up by the Security Council and go, I can't believe it, they're inconsistent. You know, it isn't one man, one vote. That these systems, and whether it's transitional justice initiatives or initiatives related to more punitive approaches like the ICTY, that when they don't produce the kind of results that we expect, and when it isn't clearly based on equality and fairness, that we can be surprised about that. And that issue of the influence of power, I guess, comes back to, again, as I say, the question of Kosovo's role in the world. It's important to remember that when the Cold War ended, I mean, I'm not saying anything that's particularly new or controversial here, we had this extraordinary situation where we moved from a bipolar world order to a unipolar world order. And the West was far more powerful in 1991 than any other, I think, unipolar power had ever been in human history. We had the idea of the end of history and the spread of liberal values, all these kinds of things that came together with respects to the spread of liberalism. So you had this coming together of unipolarity. We're the only power that really counts internationally. You also had the emergence of what's called global civil society. So non-governmental organizations, human rights organizations saying something should be done overseas. And states in the West, particularly the Clintons and the Blairs, saying, yes, we want to adopt an ethical foreign policy. And all these things come together in a perfect storm that seem to suggest, again, that we're moving towards a different world, way of doing things and enforcing human rights. However, by the mid-1990s, a lot of that optimism has started to become dispelled because of the debacle in Somalia, because of the response to Rwanda, because of, obviously, the situation in Srebrenica. And Kosovo was, in many respects, in 1999, kind of a remedy to this emerging pessimism that happened at the time. Now, Mark Weller observed that many observers, he said, have begun to see in the international response to the Kosovo crisis a new paradigm of international relations, a blueprint for a new world order. Essentially, Kosovo wasn't really about Kosovo, the intervention in Kosovo in 1999. It was about something far, far more important than that. You don't need to believe me on this. This is what General Wesley Clark said. He was the NATO Supreme Allied Commander at the time. He said, this wasn't a conflict strictly about Kosovo. It wasn't even a conflict ultimately about ethnic cleansing. It was a battle about the future of NATO, about the credibility of the United States as a force in world affairs. Now, at the start of 1999, NATO had 16 members. By 2004, it had 26. Right? So if you look at it just in those cold, hard terms, that the intervention in Kosovo led credence to the idea that NATO still had a project. NATO was still useful. And this was certainly something that the United States wanted to ensure was the case in 1999. So Kosovo served as a means by which the West could project power overseas, could present an image of itself as benevolent and powerful, as able to move into Eastern Europe, inconceivable 10 years earlier. Now, of course, if you're a Kosovo Albanian, NATO coming in and saving you from what was happening, who cares what their motivations are in some respects? And I've spoken to, obviously, lots of Kosovo Albanians whose lives were literally saved by NATO's intervention. And of course, on that level, you can understand why people here were delighted to see NATO troops. But it is important, I think, to remember that it wasn't about saving the lives of Kosovo Albanians. And this importance has become more evident, I think, as time has gone on. Why was it important then? Well, as I said, it was a symbol of Western power. And this symbol that Kosovo became was something that had to be designed in a particular way, and literally designed in a particular way. And this relates to, as people have said before, the flag, the anthem, the constitution. All of these things were imposed on Kosovo by outsiders because the people here were considered to be either too stupid to do this themselves or are likely to mess it up. So we have to ensure that our project, Kosovo, looks perfect to the international observers and demonstrates again our power. I think this was captured in particular by what Victoria Nuland, who was the US Assistant Secretary of State for European and Eurasian Affairs, said. She said, I think this was in 2014, 2015, she said, Kosovo has made considerable progress, and she heralded what she described as the political stability we see in Kosovo. And she said, Kosovo is becoming a multi-ethnic country where Kosovo Serbs, Albanians, all ethnicities live in peace. And we need this because not only does the region need that, but the planet needs that. And Kosovo has an opportunity to set that example. So Kosovo was going to be an example to the planet of basically how great the West is, how powerful the West can be, and how it can transform savage societies into something that's very, very civilized looking. The problem was, for anybody who was living here at the time, that this notion of Kosovo making considerable progress, moving towards multi-ethnicity, didn't seem to square what was happening on the ground. Where we had, and again we've heard about it from a number of people in the last couple of days, rampant corruption, huge levels of unemployment, the maintenance of ethnic segregation, and of course an unresolved international status. And ultimately, what we could see during this period again was that the West's approach was, as long as there isn't obvious violence in Kosovo, where no journalist is coming to Kosovo and saying, yet again yesterday there was a interethnic violent protest broke out in Mitrovica or something like that. If we could at least stop violence, then it would look okay. Particularly if we give them a flag and an anthem and all these kinds of things. Order was the mantra, ostensibly. This necessitated, of course, making a deal with the criminal elite, which again was spoken about today and yesterday, to ensure that you guys can do what you want internally, as long as you don't make an awful lot of noise. Our bodies aren't seen on the streets. And we will turn a blind eye to how you behave internally, provided again that you nod your heads internationally when we say something, and it looks good when we present an image of Kosovo overseas. Now, this means of dealing with Kosovo mattered to people on the ground, obviously, who could see that there was something wrong here, given the amount of external investment, experts, all these people coming to Kosovo. Why wasn't the country making progress? But ultimately, it didn't really manifest until the West began to move into its process of decline. And then I think we started to see that Kosovo's importance was very, very shallow. And Kosovo became something that was dispensable. The process of Western decline has been well documented elsewhere, but I just wanted to read out one quote from Christopher Lane, who wrote in The Atlantic about this. He says, constraints on US global activity will help fuel a shift in the distribution of power, and this will in turn magnify the effects of America's fiscal and strategic overstretch. With interests throughout Asia, the Middle East, Africa, Europe, and the Caucasus, a strategically overextended United States inevitably will need to retrench. And the point he was making here is that we will need to roll back from our commitments overseas. We will need to reevaluate what our strategic objectives are in all these different places. And this is precisely what has happened with respects to Kosovo. You can see it obviously more recently with respects to what happened with the Kurds. You know, we needed you and you were our friends, but now we don't need you anymore, and we're pulling back our commitments to you. What makes it even more ironic and tragic for the case of Kosovo is that Kosovo's importance has declined, but Serbia's has increased. Because from the point of view of the EU and the United States, but certainly the EU, we see good relations with Serbia as imperative, as a means by which we can stop Russia's influence in Europe. If we can get the Serbs on our side, then that's a huge prize. Now the problem with that is, to get the Serbs on our side, we have to deal with this issue of Kosovo. So from being on the one hand, we're here to help Kosovo, we are literally fighting against Serbia, it's now changed to, actually, we need to ensure that Serbia can join the European Union, can integrate more into the West, and Serbia is starting to make demands about Kosovo. This has meant, therefore, that Kosovo has increasingly been asked to make sacrifices so that Serbia can integrate more with the West. A dramatic change in the dynamics of the relationship between the West and Kosovo. Now you can see this manifesting in a whole range of issues, not just with respect to Serbia, but obviously with respect to the border deal with Montenegro. But in the context of the Serbian concessions, you have that in the municipalities. People have talked about it again today, particularly about the creation of the special court. There was the Western opposition to Kosovo having its own army. And the complete lack of any initiatives regarding, in this process of trying to get Serbia to join the European Union and integrate more into the West, why is there not more pressure being put on Serbia to deal with what it did in the 1990s? That's been effectively pushed aside. It most obviously, I think, manifested in the moves that seem to have stalled now, thankfully, that we should maybe carve the country up. I mean, again, who would have believed in 2008 that Western diplomats, not all of them, but certainly many prominent Western diplomats, were saying, yeah, I think it's probably a good idea if we cut off the northern part of Kosovo and give it to Serbia. It's also, I think, Kosovo's true importance to the West is very clear with respects to, something that people here, people from Kosovo will obviously deal with on a regular basis, visa liberalization. The only people west of Russia, other than Belarus, who still require a visa to travel into the Schengen area. We love you so much. We've always loved you, but we really don't want you to come to our countries. I mean, it's a bizarre juxtaposition. Also, and again has been mentioned, EU accession. Kosovo, Northern Macedonia, Albania, as has been mentioned, have been denied even starting negotiations. Kosovo's way, way down the list. Kosovo's chances of joining the EU are essentially zero. Gezim is mentioned as well, derecognition. Again, this is happening as evidence of this change in the distribution of power. The United States and the West more generally was able to bully, if you will, small states that needed the West into recognizing Kosovo. Now, we'll give you aid, but one of the things you'll have to do, amongst 20 other things, is recognize Kosovo. Now, as Western power is in decline, we start to see de-recognition. This has all meant, therefore, that Kosovo now finds itself, I think, in the midst of genuine existential crisis. That it is no longer the case that it can count on Western support. It's no longer seen by the West as somebody that needs help, as a country that needs to be supported. It's seen effectively as a problem for the West. Because how do we get Serbia to join the EU always ends up with somebody saying, well, what about Kosovo? And that therefore means that we start to turn, if you will, on Kosovo. Now, Kosovo cannot be abandoned by the West, obviously, and that's not likely to happen, given its symbolic importance, but it can be left to stagnate. And it can be left in this limbo world where it doesn't have international recognition, where there isn't any means by which it's going to join NATO or the European Union. And it is within that period that serious problems can emerge. The stagnation effect of in Kosovo could have a corrosive effect on societal stability. With unemployment, with the lack of visas, with all these various different issues emerging, the people here are naturally at some point going to say, well, we've just had enough of this. We don't see any future. We don't see any way out. Now, I was lucky enough to be here when the election results were announced last month. And of course, fantastic to see that optimism. And I would support that optimism. And I hope that the new government does implement the various different policies that are so badly needed here. But of course, there is this broader problem that exists. And it relates back to that issue of the great power game that is at play. What should Kosovo do, I think, then, moving forward? I think, firstly, there's a need for an acceptance of the reality of Kosovo's importance to the West. Now, I'm from Ireland, we think that Americans love us. You know, that's something we really pride ourselves upon. Americans really love us. They'll do anything for Ireland. It isn't true. You know, they like to say nice things about the Irish because they all want to get elected. I mean, even Obama claimed to be Irish a few years back. And somebody in Ireland did find some evidence that his great ancestors had, I don't know, gone to America. Yeah, so there was pictures all over the Irish media of Obama drinking a pint of Guinness, and we felt, yeah, you know, we're close to America again. So it's difficult to accept it when you think somebody likes you and they don't. Or they do, but for instrumental reasons. I mean, every American president wants to say something nice about the Irish because there's 40 million of us in America. 40 million. I mean, the population of Ireland is only 4 million. But anyway, that's another issue. But from the point of view of Kosovo, there is a need, I think, to accept this, that we weren't saved because we were loved. We were saved because somebody needed to present an image of themselves as benevolent and powerful. And we happened to be, as a friend of mine from Kosovo once said, we happened to be for once in our lives on the right side of history. And we were lucky. But that ultimately is what the situation is. Now, if we accept that reality, how would that manifest? I think it firstly needs to manifest in a less servile approach to the international community. I certainly find it embarrassing when Prime Minister Ramush said there is no need for foreign affairs in Kosovo as we're in the same club as the United States. We basically do what Washington tells us. You know, to say that openly, I think, is extremely embarrassing. I think it's important not to believe promises made by the West to Kosovo, but to actually look for guarantees, not promises, and to confront the West with their own rhetoric, with their own words. I mean, specifically in the context of the specialist chambers, something that I wrote recently, and Robert and Fortuna would know much more about this than I would. But in terms of, if you look at the establishment of the specialist chambers, this was presented as being part of a transitional justice initiative. Not purely transitional justice, but certainly part of that, because it would contribute to reconciliation. And you think, okay, fine. What does the EU and the UN say about transitional justice mechanisms? Well, it says that they have to have local legitimacy. They need to be derived from a bottom-up approach. This is the only way they will work. Now, if you compare that, which, as we heard earlier, that did not happen here. So we have this massive contrast between the rhetoric regarding transitional justice and the actual means by which this strange entity, the specialist chambers, was created. Now, increasingly, these kinds of things have happened here. That we have this rhetoric regarding human rights, progress, reconciliation, the 2003 Thessaloniki summit, everybody's going to join the European Union, it's going to be great, trust us. But there needs to be a more, I think, confrontation is maybe the wrong word, but more assertive stance with respect to these things. Okay, you said this, where's the evidence? And linked to that, I think there needs to be a more regional focus, especially on Albania and the Albanian diaspora. But more importantly, and I think this goes to the heart of many of the issues that have been spoken about in the last couple of days, a much more forceful stance towards Serbia, and specifically the issue of accountability, responsibility, and reparations. I mean, Carol Hodge mentioned this yesterday with respect to Dayton. We want peace, is something that everybody says, and okay, that's great. But peace can come at an enormous cost. Now, what's begun to happen in the last 5 years is that Serbia has presented itself as the sober, mature advocate of peace and progress. Look, let's just leave the past behind and let's move on. Come on, for God's sake. You had the Prime Minister of Serbia saying about the Albanians have literally just emerged from the woods recently. This kind of thing. These people are kind of savages, you know, and we wear suits and we're nice and we can speak, with some degree of authority. And this image has started to emerge of Serbia as the progressive force for stability, peace, let's leave the past behind and move on. And unfortunately, that narrative has gained traction in the West. For somebody like me, obviously it looks like an absurdity. But for people who don't know really what happened in Kosovo in 1999, it starts to seem plausible. You know, well, why don't they just sign up to this agreement and move on? Wouldn't that be okay? Now, that narrative has to be changed. Serbia is winning this narrative war. And it has been allowed to win that narrative war because successive governments in Kosovo simply haven't confronted that. And again, I'm not saying that needs to be done in an adversarial, aggressive way, but we surely can reach a point where somebody can say, hold on a minute, before we start moving forward here with this kind of idea of peace and reconciliation, these kinds of things, can we at least address what you did, in the 1990s? Can we get some statistics? Can we get some cooperation with Belgrade as to where the mass graves are? Not just here in Kosovo, but the numbers of bodies that were taken up to Serbia and buried in mass graves outside military barracks and things like that. So these facts have to be established, but not within the discourse, I think, of reconciliation, but rather to establish guilt, to punish perpetrators, and determine the nature of reparations, which again Fortuna talked about extensively. There also needs to be linked into that, I think, this counter-narrative that Albin Kurti mentioned this morning. One of the things I think that's interesting about the recent declarations in the last 2 years from the EU regarding Kosovo's chances of joining the EU, on the one hand it's very disappointing, on the other hand it's kind of liberating. If we have no chance of joining the European Union, then we don't need to necessarily pretend to be nice anymore, if you want to think of it like that. It gives an opportunity to people in Kosovo to be more honest about what we want and where we're going, and to craft this counter-narrative, I think. If the European Union, if the West, is so keen to get Serbia to join with the West, to take it away from Russia's remit, then that does give Kosovo the opportunity to say, well, wait a minute, okay, if we advance a counter-narrative that it is impossible to ignore, then these guys that really want Serbia to join will maybe flip and change and say, okay, God, we can't pretend that this discourse doesn't exist regarding the terrible things that happened in the 1990s, and because we really want those guys to join, we're going to have to get them to address this discourse. But without articulating that discourse, it can't be done. And that has to be done in a particular way. And it's one which requires, as Fortuna has mentioned, that many people have written about the, simply establishing the facts about what happened here. And ensuring that this is promoted in a way which, again, doesn't come across as aggressive, but one that puts pressure on Belgrade to simply address these facts and to put the ball in their court and say, look, we've established, not just us as Kosovo Albanians, but some kind of international group as well is involved in this, so there is some objectivity in terms of our results and our data. We've established that these things happened. This evidence cannot be refuted. What are you going to do about it? And of course, there's a huge amount of people working within Serbia and Belgrade who've documented war crimes as well. And there is existing data that can be built upon. The Humanitarian Law Centre in Belgrade and obviously here in Pristina can provide it, but they don't have all the answers. But again, this could be used to establish this counter narrative. Ultimately, it's a period at the moment, I think, of huge change internationally. Okay, that's pretty obvious. This massive macro change has filtered down into many, many different regions, and it has had a major impact on the situation here in Kosovo. It therefore means, I think, that Kosovo faces a real existential threat. It demands a new type of foreign policy and a new approach specifically to Serbia, but also to the European Union, to NATO, to the United States more generally. And it requires a more assertive, more honest foreign policy that takes into account the realities of its relationship with the West, but also the realities of this changed power dynamic internationally. And I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Thank you, Aidan. The good news for us is that you're a master at holding our attention. The bad news is that you're always going to get the graveyard slot. So we've got 15 minutes or so of discussion. This is discussion, so it doesn't have to be questions, although there are people who you can ask questions of, but it is an opportunity for you to make observations, disagree with things, say what you've agreed with, what you've most got out of it, whatever.
Hi there. Aidan, I've got a question about what you described as the kind of golden age of international law between 1994 and 2008. Firstly, why do you say that? Or potentially I've misunderstood. And then second question is, you seem like a realist. What is, and I'd welcome Robert Muharimi's perspective on this. What is your understanding of justice as a realist? Is it all about power, like everything else? Or is there something objective and maybe sort of universally recognisable about justice in international relations from a realistic perspective?
Okay, thank you. Very good questions. First of all, the idea of there being a golden era, I don't agree with that, is my point, essentially. But there were... People say it because I think that there were... I mean, if you look at... if you think about it in these terms, you know, in 20 years ago, you had Bill Clinton and Tony Blair intervening in Kosovo to protect human rights. Today, you've got Donald Trump and Boris Johnson. Now, people look at that contrast and they go, oh my God, back then we had these nice progressive people who were talking about human rights and what have you, and ethical foreign policies and these kinds of things. There was also a momentum in the 1990s propelled by global civil society activists and various different people like that to put human rights at the center of international political discourse, which I think they did. You know, it very much was a prominent issue in international relations. The problem was that you know, you say I'm a realist. I've been called worse, you know. But the issue is that there was an awful lot of hot air. There was a lot of rhetoric about these things, you know. And if you look at the actual practice of states and the way in which states behaved in that time, I think there's glaring inconsistencies. So, you know, we were talking about human rights. We were talking about international law. We were talking about reforming the UN and all these kinds of things. The EU was getting bigger. We developed the International Criminal Court. There was all these kinds of things. But, okay, what about the fact that? And you could pick out lots of different issues there. I mean, Mark Weller has written extensively about the extent to which the United States not just didn't like the establishment of the International Criminal Court, but actively worked to undermine it, to try to bully other states into not joining it. He talks about the fact that they passed the what was called the Invade the Hague Act. If any US person is ever sent to the International Criminal Court, we reserve the right to use military force to, you know, spring them from jail, like some kind of cowboy movie. But that is a fact. There was obviously, as I said, the invasion of Iraq. There was the lack of intervention in Rwanda in 1994, but we did intervene in Haiti in 1994. We intervened in Kosovo in 1999 because we can't sleep at night when there's human rights violations taking place. However, if it's the Kurds in Turkey, we don't really have a problem with that because Turkey is our friend. So there was this prevailing inconsistency that people like me, and possibly, I didn't know Robert back then, but possibly me and Robert were looking at this at times going, wait a minute, this doesn't seem, you know, this doesn't seem to be this dawn of a new era. It seems to be, I described this in a different context as the permanence of inconsistency. The one thing you can be sure of is that great powers will always behave selectively when it comes to norms and laws and things like that. And the question regarding justice, I think if you look at any normative understanding of how a political system should work, one of the key features is that you have a separation between the judiciary and the executive. That has to be evident. Otherwise you have a kind of a monarchical system where the king decides who's guilty and who's innocent. And we moved away from that when we created democratic systems. But we moved away from that not because we thought humans were inherently good, but because we accepted that humans are not necessarily inherently wicked, but that they will certainly exploit loopholes. This is people like Reinhold Niebuhr writing about this, saying we have democratic systems because we need to ensure that there are laws in place that will stop people exploiting the lack of laws. So we created these normative systems. Internationally, we simply don't have that at all. The international legal order comprises this conflation between politics and law enforcement. I mean, if you looked at I've described the UN previously, and I like the UN, I like the idea of the UN, but I described it as a failed state. Because you wouldn't see this. If you saw a system where the 5 most powerful actors inside a state were also the actors that decided how the laws of the state were enforced, we'd all say, well, wait a minute, you can't possibly think of that as a functioning legal order. It's completely dysfunctional. It's a failed state. We would all laugh at it and say, well, that's a corrupt regime, that's authoritarianism, that's fascism. Yet the UN is based on that. That's what the UN is. The UN has at its core these 5 states. Now, if we want laws to be enforced, and we think about it in the context of Syria, we get all these experts around the world to go to Syria to compile reports about how many people have been killed, who's killed them, and ultimately we go to the Security Council. You know, we know what Russia and China are going to say. they're not going to read these bloody reports. They're just going to say, well, he's our friend. And it's not just the mean and nasty Russians and the Chinese. The UK will always support Bahrain, no matter what it's done. The US will always support Israel. And France will support its minions in Africa. So all the countries on the P5 have these allies that they will support. And I don't think you need to be a complete cynic to look at this and go, well, something has gone terribly wrong. If our entire legal edifice is built around the enforcement of law by political actors. So in that system, I think justice on the international level can be achieved in certain contexts, but we can't separate the political reality of the creation of a number of things. So like the ICTY, I mean, I think you'd be foolish to go, well, the ICTY was a political body and therefore everything it did was wrong. That would be nonsense. Of course the ICTY did some fantastic things. And it did bring about justice in a number of cases. But likewise, you can't be naive enough to think that the ICTY was not a political body in terms of its creation and remit and things like that. But that's not to say that everybody who served as a prosecutor or defendant or judge in the ICTY context was compromised politically. But that in and of itself was a function of a particular confluence of factors and doesn't herald a new world order where justice is going to be achieved around the world. It was a specific, context-specific institutional development that was derived from political expediency.
Aidan, your argument about the specialist chambers being a present given by someone to Serbia is pretty well irresistible. I've heard it said and attributed to a senior American politician that that was exactly what happened. Have you got any such hard, as we might call it, evidence, or is it just a matter of inference?
I think, well, hard evidence. No, I mean, I think you know it's been mentioned in the last couple of days, and certainly today as well, that it's hardly a coincidence. You know, that this discourse emerged, that this institution emerged at a time when a particular discourse and a framing of the situation was coming to pass. I spoke to Sonia Bezerko in Belgrade last year, and I think you were making the same point about this. So it's certainly not my idea. You know, a lot of people would make that point. So yeah, I think it's pretty clear. That said, I'm not sure that it's necessarily the case that because this was created to appease Serbia, there was no crimes committed by Kosovo Albanians in that period. You know, I think that's a separate issue. I think, you know.
Thank you very much for an excellent presentation. I would like to emphasize what you said regarding the establishment of specialist court. That it is a gesture of international community for pleasing Serbia and spoiling Serbia at this particular time. I agree with you because the Dick Marty report, it was not the first report speaking of crimes that happened after the war. Of course, not in derogatory terms as Dick Marty report. Immediately after the war, actually in the year 2000, we had the famous OSCE report, What's Seen, What Heard, What's Seen. It was in the year 2000, very famous report. It was a bit or exaggerated one, but it spoke a lot about crimes done by Albanians. Immediately after the report was issued, international community or someone, I think OSCE also, came up with this idea of establishing a world war crime, Kosovo war crime and ethnic crime court. However, many organizations around were very excited about this proposal. International community had to do something and deal properly with war crimes. However, the decision was not taken here. It was taken in New York, UN New York, and immediately refused by UN New York. who was the real decision maker, I don't know, but the justification for not establishing the court was the lack of budget. Now, I think the budgetary situation is not better, but now international community, EU and US government suddenly have all these funds and a huge budget to establish something that is really very insulting for the Albanians in Kosovo that never experienced the real dealing with war crimes. Another thing that was pleasing Serbia is the association of Serbian populated municipalities. It's not a problem only the structure of this association, but also a very derogatory term with the naming of this association as Albin Kurti calls it, Zajednica, because Nena knows this better. With Zajednicas in Croatia, really the war started. And using the need for translating the word association is really not needed, because in all three languages we can use the word association. In Serbian and in many laws in Kosovo, the word association is not translated at all, because it could be used in Serbian, and it is used also in Albanian. Why this term needed to be translated? And the reality is to please Serbia, because it is associated with all initiatives of expanding the territory as it was envisioned in the time of Milosevic. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for the question. I mean, just in terms of the first one, I mean, I would come back to my point again about which again isn't my idea. I think most people who've looked into this would say it's simply true that the international system is not one that lends itself to the impartial allocation of justice, that it's not a system that power determines who is punished and who is allowed to go free. And because of the influence of power, decisions are made selectively as to when and where to enforce international law. And somebody made a decision that we need to establish the specialist chambers in 2014, around that kind of a time. And you would, of course, ask the question, why? Why then? And that leads to, Jeffrey's point and other people's. Well, there was something else was happening here that allowed this to come to pass. But was that the most pressing issue that Kosovo faced? Or was it the issue relating to crimes committed by Serbia in Kosovo in the 1990s? And I would suggest it certainly was that one. But nonetheless, I do want to emphasize this. You mentioned the OSCE report as seen, as told. Certainly the second volume of that talks about crimes committed by Albanians against Serbs and moderate Albanians and things like that. If you're going to use the discourse of human rights, then we must accept that human rights are human rights, and that everybody has, not just because they're Albanians. Yeah, and if we're going to say that it's wrong to engage in ethnic cleansing and murder and torture and rape and all these kinds of things, then it's wrong whoever does it. Now, I think people will look at a number of the... I mean, the Marty report is clearly flawed, but there are very reputable international reports into what happened in that period that do seem to clearly point to there having been crimes against humanity and various other different things committed against Serbs, Roma, and Albanians, it must be mentioned. Now, that surely has to be dealt with. Yeah? So I don't have an issue with that, and I think most people that I speak to don't really necessarily have an issue with that either. But the question is, of course, well, why do we have to deal with it in this particular way? And I always find it remarkable that somebody said, well, we have to have the court based in The Hague, and there can't be any Kosovo Albanians involved in it because they're all corrupt, If we did it domestically, the domestic courts in Kosovo are a mess. And then think, well, wait a minute, you've been here since 1999. How can the domestic courts be so bad that they can't take on these cases if you were meant to reform these courts for the last 20 years? I mean, it's a damning indictment of what the international community has done. That we can't trust the courts we set up, established, trained the people involved in it, oh God, we have to go somewhere else. I mean, that really is, like I said, a damning indictment of the state-building process that's taken place here.
Good, thank you very much.
Okay.
No, that's it. Thank you very much. That's all from me. Hand over to